it's your story doesn't mean you even understand it to start with. It's your story doesn't mean you can tell it. For example, a story carries a burden. So the difference between story and storytelling. And most of the time people look at those two concepts and think they are the same, but they're also different. Our story is like a journey, right? It's like an experience, it's like an history. History is an unended dialogue between the past and the present. Our story is always our journey. And sometimes we might still be living the journey, right? Sometimes we might still be thinking of the journey of the experience. So when you think about the story, think about a journey, think about where you're going to, are you actually ready to tell the story? By identifying the conflicts in our story and identifying the core of our story. And that's what gives stories meaning. Hello, everyone. It's great to be back again to share my own ideas. And one of the topics that I spoke about a lot last year was storytelling. And I got so many questions around storytelling. I got so many ideas around it. And I'll be sharing some of those reflections and some of those lessons with you. And one of the reflections or one of the lessons that I'll be sharing with you is the difference between story and storytelling. And most of the time people look at those two concepts and think they are the same, but they're also different. And the reason why I say they are different is that for story and storytelling to converge, you have to first separate them. So what's like a story, for example? A story is everything about you, right? It's about your journey, it's about your history, it's where you're coming from, it's every single thing about you. And we have lived different kind of story. We have lived different kind of experience. Some of those experiences that we don't want even the world to know of, right? And some of the things we've done that maybe nobody until we die will probably know of them. And I think, those stories can either make us, or they can either mar us, or they can either break us. And that's why I think it's very important when you think about storytelling and you think about story, you have to distinguish the two, and then you have to bring it back, because it's your story doesn't mean you even understand it to start with. It's your story doesn't mean you can tell it. For example, it's your story doesn't mean you are able to communicate what your story is. So it might be your story, but you have to understand your story before you can tell that story. And that's why I think, when you think about the idea of story and storytelling, you have to separate them first. So you have to sit with the story. So what's my story? What's my story all about? Where am I coming from? What's my journey? And then you sit down, you reflect on that story. As you're reflecting on the story, you're understanding the story, you're understanding the journey, you're understanding, the parts of the story that you want to communicate. You're understanding the part of the story that you don't want to communicate, that you want to leave out, or the story you're still processing that, I don't think I am ready yet to tell the story because I don't understand the story yet. And the process of understanding the story, the process of reflecting on the story is probably you also having conversation with somebody, talking to somebody, chatting with them, trying to navigate what the story is, especially with somebody that you can really trust, a friend. Because sometimes when you even have one-to-one conversation and you're talking about your story, sometimes that can be really, really difficult to even do. But that's the process of which you get to now understand the story. And I can say this because there are some of my stories that people think that I tell, but I might sit with that story for years and years and years, because what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to understand it. For a very, very long time, I wasn't even telling my story. Because I was still trying to understand what that story really is, right? So I was still trying to understand what that journey really is. I was still trying to understand, my own journey and my own story. So that's why I think, for us to tell our story, we have to understand our story before we tell it. We don't just go ahead and start telling stories, because whatever happened might be disastrous or dangerous when we kind of release such a story. And I think, one of the things that about storytelling is that you also have to understand the consequences of that story. And I think I've hammered on this a lot, that we need to understand what's the consequences of the story, what's the burden of the story, right? Because a story carries a burden. So you need to understand, what's the burden of that story and how do you want to tell that, right? And that's where storytelling comes from. And then the storytelling itself is the art of the story is the art of which you tell the story, is the art of at which you profess some of those ideas within you. And by understanding your story, then you're now telling it in a way that people can connect to, people can relate to. you're thinking about, now I can remove this part of the story. I can remove this part of the story that I don't want to tell, that I don't want people to know. And that's fine. I could recall that I had an interview, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, and somebody was trying to dig into my background, like really going deeper into my background and into my own experience. And I look at it and I told the person that actually I'm not ready to tell the story yet. I'm not ready to talk about this part of my life. I'm not ready to talk about this part of my experience. And you might be wondering that, why did I tell them that? It was because I've been able to understand that story. I've been able to understand the burden of that story, the consequences of that story, and the effect of which that story might have on somebody else when I release it or when I talk about it. Because when I think about the story that I'm trying to tell, or when I think about telling my story, I'm also thinking about all of the participants in that story. Because when we live stories, we are not just living story as an entity on our own. We are living stories in connection with other stories that comes across us, as people, as individuals in our lives. And those people might, treat us really well. Some might not treat us really well. So it's like, it's a journey on its own, in its own way. And you don't want to portray somebody, as a bad person when you've not understood even the nuances of the story, or you've not even understood the multitude that a story might carry, that even though you're saying somebody's a bad person, you might also be bad as well. So it's like you're kind of like, reflecting, understanding the nuances of the story, understanding, the burden of that story. And I think this is where, storytelling is important. That, how do we then tell our story in a way that inspires, in a way that informs, in a way that encourages other people to take action, and in a way that it, forces people to believe and to create, the change we want to see in our society. And I think, for me, that's the whole idea around stories and storytelling. And that's the question that I get most of the time when I talk about story and storytelling, that, even though you say that it's different, what does that mean? So I just want to quickly share, what that means, that even though story and storytelling might mean the same thing, they are also very different. And for a way to bring it together, we have to first separate the two for them to converge as well. And I think that's one idea or one lesson that I want to share with us today. Another thing that I was reflecting on, when I think about, story, or when I think about, the idea of, storytelling, is the stories that are grounded in movies, or the stories that are grounded in series. I've been watching a lot of series this year. And if you don't know, I actually love K-drama. So I watch a lot of it. And I could recall my flatmate was even telling me that it seems it's K-drama that is watching you these days. But I think there's something that I've learned, from, watching K-drama, or whether action movies or whatever kind of like movies or series that I've seen, is there's something about the story that revolves around the tension within the story, right? You look at the story and you see where the tension is being built in the story. That what makes a story interesting is the tension within the story, is the difficulties within that story, is the where you grip your heart and be like, and your heart be like, when you're watching the movie, because you're watching the series and then there's a particular point where you grip yourself, you grip your heart in a way. And I think, if a movie or a series hasn't gotten to that level, I don't think that movie or series is interesting. I don't think it will be interesting, because I think the best of the series are the series that actually grips you to the heart, like grips you to the core, a kind of like a series or a movie that shakes your core, that shakes something about you. And when I think about, when I watch those movies, I look at, the reason why the stories are interesting is not of the good beginning, right? It's not even because of the happy ending or whatever happened in the ending, or even the sad ending. That's not what makes a story a story. That's not what makes, the story important in a way. What makes the story important, what grips our hearts, is the tension within the story, is the crisis within the story, is the conflict, within the story. So whenever we are trying to tell a story, we need to understand what is the tension within the story, right? What is the conflict within the story? What are the crises within the story? What are the points where you're like actually grappling, with the story, the difficulties in the story? And by identifying the tension within our story, by identifying the conflicts within our story, by identifying how we overcome that conflict within our story, that's when we can actually understand the juice of a particular story as well. That what's the juice of the story, and how do I squeeze the juice of the story, and how do I tell it, right? So you're like looking at the story and you're looking at the conflict within the story. So for me, whenever I try to tell a story, whenever I'm working on my, when I'm trying to like, tell my story, whether on social media, whether I'm giving a speech, whether I'm giving a talk, one of the things that I like to look at, or I try to understand, is where is the conflict within the story, and then I try to communicate, using that means or that process. That doesn't mean that you won't have a strong beginning though, or it doesn't mean that you won't have a good ending, whether sad or happy ending. But the most important piece of telling our story is more or less understanding the conflict. And when you look at our story, like I said, storytelling is connected to what we do real life, right? You're not just telling a story of things that has not happened. You're telling a story of an history. You're accounting for something. You're telling a story of something that has already happened. And when you're telling a story of something that has already happened, you understand that when you're trying to do something, you're building something, there will always be conflicts in between. So pay attention to those conflicts and be able to bring that into the stories that you're trying to tell. And I can go in my life to talk about, multiple conflicts that I've, faced in my own life or in my own journey. Was he traveling, to Ghana by road without having money to return for the African SSG Summit? That's a conflict within that story, right? Within my own even story, my own journey as a young leader, without the resources, who is trying to create a pathway for himself, having to travel to Ghana by road, without having the money to return. Or it could even mean, when when I was applying for a job or a role back then in Nigeria. It was a remote job for a regional manager role, and I didn't have airtime, and I borrowed airtime from all the internet provider. Like I was borrowing airtime all through, to take on the interview, and I ended up getting the job, right? So again, these are the conflicts in the stories, and these are the things you understand in your own journey, your own story of what are the things that actually makes you, it's those moments of conflict, it's those moments where you have to, dig deep into your own core and find courage within yourself, And I think when we're thinking of storytelling, or when we're thinking of telling our own stories, is by identifying the conflicts in our story and identifying the core of our story, and being able to dig deep into what those things mean, being able to explore the meaning of the conflict in our stories, and to be able to tell it as well. And the last bit of the things I'm going to be sharing around storytelling is that our story is like a journey, right? It's like an experience, it's like an history. And like I have said again, I think I've said this before, E.H. said, history is an unended dialogue, between the past and the present, right? And I think, our story is always our journey. And sometimes we might still be living the journey, right? Sometimes we might still be thinking of the journey of the experience. So when you think about the story, think about a journey, think about where you're going to, are you actually ready to tell the story? Because you're still living the story, you're still living the journey. For some people, they like to tell the story, as they go along the journey. That's somebody like me. Like, I don't want to just tell the story at the end of the journey. I want to tell the story, of the process of the journey, right? I want to tell the story of that process in a way that is grounded in humility and respect, for myself, and respect for the people I tell their stories within that story. And I think, when we also treat a story as a journey, we're able to understand what are the experiences within this journey, what are the lessons within this journey, and we're able to look at the journey as a whole and be able to squeeze lessons out of that journey and that experience. And so if you want to treat story, also treat story as a journey. I said this is going to be the last thing that I'm going to say, but all of a sudden something just popped into my head now, and it was based on my video that went viral recently. It got a lot of comments. There were so many good comments, and it was my Being a Diba Alumni Award video where I spoke about grief. And it went viral with millions and millions of views, and with thousands and thousands of comments, tens of thousands of comments as well. And there were also sometimes you look at a lot of positive comments and a lot of people who have been inspired by something, and then you just pick on some few negative comments here and there. And I think it's very important for me to address some of those comments, because I didn't have an opportunity to actually reply people. And I just want to say that, for example, people were like saying, why didn't you talk about your dad in the video? And I want to use this to educate and tell you something about storytelling as well. The center of that story wasn't about my dad. The center of that story was my mom, right? She was the person I lost when I was 7, and it was how I grieved, and it was how, that grief carried me to this point that I am today, to doing all the things that I've created, all the innovation that I've created. And it doesn't mean that my dad wasn't important as well, right? I mean, I've spoken about my dad multiple times on social media. I've spoken about how he, paid, for my, fees through secondary school, and how he succeeded in the streets, and how he, sent me to a computer school when I was 13, and I learned about, desktop publishing, graphics design. I was introduced to the internet for the first time. There were so many things I learned in the computer school, and I can tell you that some of those experiences is what shaped, some of the things I ended up building now. When I talk about technology, when I talk about tech, when I talk about, working on AI solution, when I talk about all of the different things that I've done, right? And some of the, knowledge that I've been able to garner, it was because I had all of those education, all of those experience. And even though I was growing up in Makoko, my dad actually sent me to, schools, to the best schools within the community. I was going to a school in Alagomeji. It was a Montessori school where I learned how to read and write, and so many other things that happened along the journey. So, my dad is also like an hero in this story, but the center of that story was grief. And I think, when you're thinking about storytelling, you need to think about the center of the story, who is the hero of the story, and focus on the subject. The hero of that story was particularly my mom. That was the center of that story. That was the subject of that story. And it was very important for the stories not to lose the meaning of the story, right? And by focusing on the center of the story, you don't lose the meaning of a particular story, right? So when you think about the story, and I think I learned this from Henry Anomodo, is that who is the subject of the story? Who is the center of the story? Who is that person you want to focus on that story? And because once you start talking about every single other things, you lose the meaning in a particular story, especially for a speech that is less than 3 minutes, right? You can't start talking about everything or everything within that story. So for me, it's being able to understand the center of the story, being able to understand the message I want to pass, and being able to focus on that message and that subject of the story. So again, it doesn't mean that, I've not given a shout out to my dad. I've given a shout out to him multiple times, and I'm doing the same now. And, for being an incredible person, and for supporting me along the journey, and giving me that background to be able to thrive now today in every single thing that I'm doing, and every work that I've done. And I just want to mention that so that it doesn't cost, because I've started seeing people going through parental wars and all of sorts, and I couldn't respond to them. But I was thinking that I could use this to educate, and I could use this to pass a message around, storytelling. When it comes to telling the story, how you focus on the center, who is at the center of the story, who is the subject of the story, and then focusing on that subject to be able to tell the story as well, so that your story is not misaligned, and you're not you don't start saying different things that doesn't connect, to the story as well. And I think this is where social media also has a lot of work needs to be done on social media, because you read the comments and you look at it, and then you start judging yourself by the comments. And I think one of the things that I've said is that beyond social media, it's very important for us to have a sense of self, for us to, understand who we are, for us to understand, what our story is, for us to understand what we're already doing in real life. And for me, it's if I've spoken about things in the past, or I've showcased my dad in the past, then I don't need to worry about such a comment as well. But for the purpose of education, I think it was very important for me to highlight that, and to tell us that, when we think about stories, we need to focus on the center of the story, and that's what gives stories meaning, and maybe, that's why people resonate to a story, because it's not going around the bush and cutting around multiple other things, but we are rather focusing on the subject of the story, and we are focusing on what is important in that story, and who is important in that story, and who is important in that particular journey and that experience as well. For every moment that I think about that story, when I spoke about grief and losing my mom at 7, and how I have never had the privilege to grieve, and how that how that encouraged me to do the things that I've done today, I looked at it and I was like, maybe my mom has gone ahead of me, right? So that I can live this kind of life that I'm living, Maybe I won't be able to do all of this incredible work that I've done if I didn't have that experience of grief, and how grief became my purpose, how grief became my means of creation, and how, you know, that has made me created like one of the groundbreaking innovation in the world, Rafiki AI, which is African first generative AI career advice and counsel for underserved and displaced young people. And how, you know, that has made me write content and write books, and, you know, and continue to live in a way that I can inspire my world. So, you know, it's powerful to understand, you know, the center and the core of our stories. And, you know, I just want to share that, and to help you think about the center of your own story as well. I hope you're inspired by this, and thank you for listening to my last version of storytelling. And hopefully I might still get more inspiration and talk more about storytelling in the future. Thank you.